The dusty road to Sweetwater Creek had never felt longer than it did on that sweltering July afternoon in 1876, when Sarah McKenzie stood in the doorway of her weathered farmhouse and watched the banker's polished black carriage roll toward her property like a harbinger of doom. Her hands trembled as she gripped the worn wooden frame, her knuckles white against the splintered surface. 3 years of drought had turned her once fertile land into a patchwork of cracked earth and struggling crops. Her husband Daniel had died 18 months ago when his horse spooked during a thunderstorm, throwing him against the rocks near the river. Since then, Sarah had been fighting alone to keep their dream alive, to hold on to the 200 acres they had carved from the wilderness with their own hands and hearts. She was 24 years old, too young to be a widow, too stubborn to give up without a fight. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and her calico dress had been mended so many times that she could barely remember what it looked like new. But her green eyes held a fierce determination that had kept her going through every hardship, every sleepless night, every moment when she wanted to collapse under the weight of her grief and exhaustion. The carriage stopped in front of her house, and Morton Blackwell stepped out with the careful precision of a man who never got dirt on his expensive suits. He was 53 years old, portly and balding, with cold gray eyes that calculated everything in terms of profit and loss. He had been patient with Sarah after Daniel's death, patient in the way a cat is patient with a mouse, waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. "Mrs. McKenzie," he said, tipping his hat with false courtesy, "I trust you know why I'm here." Sarah forced herself to stand straight, to meet his gaze without flinching. "I know, Mr. Blackwell, but I asked for more time. The cattle sale is next month, and I will have enough then to make a payment." Blackwell shook his head slowly, pulling a thick envelope from his coat pocket. "I'm afraid that will not be sufficient. The bank has been more than generous, Mrs. McKenzie. Your loan is 3 months overdue, and the total amount, including interest and penalties, now stands at $1,247. I need payment in full by Friday, or I will be forced to foreclose on this property." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. $1,247. It might as well have been $1 million. She had barely $200 saved, and the cattle would not bring in more than another $300 at best. She opened her mouth to protest, to plead, to argue, but the look on Blackwell's face told her it would be pointless. "Friday," she whispered. "That's only 3 days from now." "I am aware," Blackwell said, climbing back into his carriage. "Good day, Mrs. McKenzie. I do hope you will make arrangements to vacate the premises should you be unable to meet your obligations." Sarah watched the carriage disappear down the road, dust rising in its wake like smoke from a funeral pyre. She sank down onto the porch steps, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. Everything she and Daniel had worked for, everything they had sacrificed and dreamed was about to be torn away from her. She buried her face in her hands, but she did not cry. She had learned over the past 18 months that tears changed nothing, that grief was a luxury she could not afford. She did not know that high up in the pine-covered mountains overlooking her valley, a man was watching through a battered spyglass he had carried since his days as an Army scout. Jacob Thorne had been observing Sarah McKenzie's struggles for months now, ever since he had first seen her working in her fields with a determination that reminded him of a wildcat defending her den. He was 31 years old, 6 feet 4 inches of solid muscle and quiet strength, with shoulder-length dark hair streaked with brown from the sun and a beard that he kept trimmed just enough to stay civilized. His hands were scarred from years of survival in the wilderness, his body honed by a life that demanded constant vigilance and absolute self-reliance. He had come to these mountains 5 years ago, seeking solitude after too many years of violence and blood during the war and its aftermath. He had been a soldier, a scout, a hunter, and a man who had seen the worst that humanity could offer. The mountains had given him peace, a chance to heal wounds that ran deeper than flesh and bone. He lived in a sturdy cabin he had built with his own hands, trapping and hunting for his livelihood, trading pelts and meat in town when he needed supplies. But lately, his solitude had felt more like loneliness, and watching Sarah McKenzie fight for her land had awakened something in him that he thought had died years ago. He had never spoken to her, never made his presence known, but he had helped her in small ways. A deer left hanging near her smokehouse when her supplies ran low, firewood stacked mysteriously by her barn, tracks from predators that had been lured away from her livestock with bait and patience. Now, as he watched her sitting on those porch steps with her shoulders bowed under an invisible weight, Jacob felt something shift inside his chest. He had heard Blackwell's words clearly in the quiet afternoon air, carried up the hillside by the peculiar acoustics of the valley. $1,247. Friday. Jacob lowered the spyglass and stared at the distant figure of Sarah McKenzie for a long moment. Then he turned and walked into his cabin, moving with the purposeful stride of a man who had made a decision. He pulled up a loose floorboard near his fireplace and reached into the space beneath, pulling out a heavy canvas bag that clinked softly with the weight of gold and silver coins. This was his savings from years of careful living, the nest egg he had been accumulating without any particular plan for its use. He had never cared much about money, taking only what he needed and letting the rest accumulate like snow in a drift. He counted it out on his rough-hewn table. $1,432. More than enough. He stared at the pile of coins for a long time, thinking about what this meant, what he was about to do. He was not a man given to impulsive actions, but neither was he a man who could stand by and watch someone lose everything when he had the power to prevent it. The next morning, Jacob rode into Sweetwater Creek on his big roan gelding, the canvas bag heavy in his saddlebags. The town was small but growing, with a main street lined with shops and businesses catering to the ranchers and farmers who worked the surrounding land. The bank stood at the corner of Main and Church Streets, a two-story brick building that Blackwell had built to project an air of permanence and prosperity. Jacob tied his horse to the hitching post and stood for a moment, adjusting to the press of humanity after weeks alone in the mountains. He was not comfortable in towns, never had been, but he made himself walk through the door and into the cool interior of the bank. A young clerk looked up from his desk, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of Jacob. It was not every day that a mountain man walked into Blackwell's bank, especially one who looked like he could break the furniture with his bare hands. "I need to see Blackwell," Jacob said, his voice rough from disuse. "Do you have an appointment?" the clerk asked nervously. "No." "Well, I'm afraid Mr. Blackwell is very busy, and he only sees people by appointment." Jacob stared at the clerk until the younger man shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Tell him it is about the McKenzie loan." The clerk's eyebrows rose and he scurried through a door behind his desk. Jacob waited, his hands loose at his sides, his eyes scanning the room with the automatic awareness of a man who had survived by paying attention to details. The bank was well appointed, with polished wood and brass fixtures that spoke of Blackwell's success. There were 3 other clerks working at desks, and a large safe stood against the back wall like an iron sentinel guarding its treasures. The door opened again, and Blackwell emerged, his expression curious and slightly annoyed. "I understand you wish to discuss the McKenzie property," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Not discuss," Jacob said. "Pay." Blackwell's eyes narrowed. "I beg your pardon?" Jacob reached into his coat and pulled out the canvas bag, setting it on the nearest desk with a heavy thud. "I'm here to pay off Sarah McKenzie's loan, all of it, principal, interest, penalties, everything she owes." The bank fell silent. Every clerk had stopped working, staring at the scene unfolding before them. Blackwell's face had gone through several shades of color, finally settling on an unpleasant red. "And who might you be?" Blackwell asked slowly. "Name does not matter. How much does she owe?" Blackwell looked like he had bitten into something sour. "The loan is a private matter between Mrs. McKenzie and this bank." "You told her the amount 3 days ago standing in her yard where anyone could hear," Jacob said. $1,247. I am paying it." "On whose authority?" Blackwell demanded. "Mine." Jacob's voice was flat, brooking no argument. "You want the money or not?" Blackwell hesitated, and Jacob could see the calculation in his eyes. The banker had been planning to foreclose, to take the land and sell it at a profit. But refusing payment on a legitimate debt would raise questions, possibly legal ones, and Blackwell was too smart to expose himself to that kind of scrutiny. "Very well," Blackwell said finally, his voice tight. "Thomas, bring me the McKenzie file." The young clerk scrambled to obey, pulling a folder from a filing cabinet and handing it to his employer. Blackwell made a show of reviewing the papers, then nodded curtly. The exact amount is $1,247.32. Jacob counted out the money with careful precision, stacking the coins in neat piles on the desk. Blackwell watched with the expression of a man watching his dinner being taken away just as he was about to eat. When the full amount was counted, Blackwell personally verified each stack, then wrote out a receipt in his precise handwriting. "I will need a name for the receipt," he said. "Put it in her name. This pays off her loan. That is all you need to know." "I'm afraid I cannot issue a receipt without knowing who made the payment." Jacob leaned forward slightly, just enough to remind Blackwell of the considerable difference in their sizes and capabilities. "You can and you will. Mark it as paid in full, with all debts satisfied. Give me the receipt and the deed papers showing clear title." Blackwell's jaw clenched, but he bent over the desk and wrote. When he finished, he blotted the ink carefully and handed the papers to Jacob. "The mortgage is paid in full. Mrs. McKenzie owns the property free and clear." Jacob took the papers, folded them carefully, and tucked them inside his coat. He turned and walked out of the bank without another word, leaving Blackwell staring after him with a mixture of fury and bafflement. Jacob rode back to the mountains, but he did not go straight to his cabin. Instead, he made his way down through the pine forests and across the creek to the edge of Sarah McKenzie's property. He waited until dusk, when the long shadows would hide his approach, then rode quietly to her farmhouse and left the papers wedged in her doorframe where she would find them first thing in the morning. He did not knock. He did not announce himself. He simply placed the papers where she would see them and rode away into the gathering darkness, his heart beating harder than it had any right to. Sarah found the papers at dawn when she opened her door to begin her morning chores. At first, she did not understand what she was looking at. The official bank documents seemed impossible, like something from a dream. But as she read through them, her hands began to shake so badly that she had to sit down right there on the porch steps. Paid in full. All debts satisfied. Clear title. She read the words over and over, unable to believe what she was seeing. Someone had paid her entire debt. Someone had walked into Blackwell's bank and handed over more than $1,200 to save her land. But who? And why? There was no name on the receipt except her own. No explanation, no note, nothing to tell her who her mysterious benefactor might be. She pressed the papers against her chest, tears streaming down her face for the first time in months. Relief flooded through her like a spring thaw, washing away the crushing weight of fear and desperation that had been grinding her down day by day. But along with the relief came a desperate need to know. Who had done this? Who had given her back her life, her home, her future? She had to find out. She had to thank them, to somehow repay this incredible kindness. Sarah spent the morning doing her chores in a daze, her mind churning through possibilities. She did not have wealthy relatives. She had few friends in town, most people being too busy with their own struggles to spare much thought for a widow's troubles. Blackwell had certainly not done it out of the goodness of his non-existent heart. So who? That afternoon, she rode into town on her old mare, the papers safely tucked in her saddlebag. She went straight to the bank, her chin raised and her eyes bright with determination. Blackwell looked up from his desk with poorly concealed irritation when she walked in. "Mrs. McKenzie, I trust you received the papers?" "I did," Sarah said, "and I need to know who paid my debt." "I'm not at liberty to say." "Mr. Blackwell, someone gave me back my life. I have a right to know who it was." Blackwell leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together. "The gentleman in question specifically requested anonymity. I am bound to honor that request." "Please," Sarah said, her voice softening, "please, I need to know. I need to thank him." "I am sorry, Mrs. McKenzie, but my answer remains the same. Your debt is paid. Your property is yours. That is all you need to know." Blackwell's expression made it clear that the conversation was over. Sarah left the bank frustrated and confused, but she was not ready to give up. She spent the rest of the afternoon asking discreet questions around town, trying to find out if anyone had seen a stranger at the bank or heard anything about her situation. Most people were happy for her good fortune, but had no useful information to share. It was the blacksmith, Tom Henderson, who finally gave her a lead. I did see someone unusual at the bank yesterday morning, Tom said, hammering a horseshoe into shape on his anvil. Big fellow, dressed like a mountain man, rode a big roan horse. I only noticed because you don't see many like him come down into town. A mountain man? Sarah asked, her heart beginning to beat faster. Yep. Looked like he could wrestle a bear and come out ahead. Long dark hair, serious expression. Didn't stay long. Just went into the bank and came out maybe 20 minutes later. Sarah thanked Tom and rode home slowly, her mind working through this new information. A mountain man. She had heard stories about the men who lived up in the high country, trappers and hunters who preferred solitude to civilization. But why would one of them care about her problems? Why would he have that kind of money? And why would he spend it on a woman he presumably did not even know? The questions haunted her through the evening as she did her chores and made her simple dinner. She sat on her porch as the sun set, staring up at the mountains that loomed over her valley like protective giants. Somewhere up there, her mysterious benefactor was probably going about his evening, unaware of how completely he had changed her life. Or maybe he was aware. Maybe he was watching even now, making sure she was all right. The thought should have been unsettling, but instead, Sarah found it strangely comforting. Someone cared whether she succeeded or failed. Someone had seen her struggle and decided to help, expecting nothing in return. In a world that had seemed increasingly harsh and uncaring, that anonymous act of kindness felt like a miracle. Over the following days, Sarah found herself looking toward the mountains more and more often, wondering about the man who lived up there. She noticed things she had not paid attention to before. The deer that appeared near her smokehouse when her meat supplies ran low. The firewood that somehow accumulated by her barn. The way predators seemed to avoid her livestock more than they should. Someone had been helping her for a long time, she realized. Someone had been watching over her like a silent guardian, protecting her in small ways that she had attributed to luck or coincidence. The paid debt was not an isolated act of kindness. It was part of a pattern, a sustained effort to keep her safe and help her survive. The realization made her feel vulnerable and protected at the same time. She did not know what to do with the knowledge, how to respond to a kindness she could not directly acknowledge, but she found herself speaking out loud sometimes as she worked, as if her guardian could hear her. "Thank you for the deer," she would say. "My stores were getting low. The wood is a blessing. Winter is coming sooner than I expected. I do not know who you are, but I am grateful, more grateful than I can say." She never received an answer, but somehow she felt heard. Jacob watched these small, one-sided conversations from his vantage points around her property, and each time she spoke, something inside him responded like a chord being struck. He had not expected her to notice his other help, had not anticipated that she would start trying to communicate with him. He knew he should stop watching, should let her live her life without his invisible presence, but he could not seem to make himself stay away. He told himself he was just making sure she was safe, that Blackwell did not try anything underhanded, that her land and livestock were secure. But the truth, which he was slowly being forced to acknowledge, was that he had become deeply invested in Sarah McKenzie's well-being in a way that went far beyond simple kindness. He thought about her constantly, the way she moved with efficient grace as she worked, the determination in her eyes, the softness of her voice when she spoke her thanks to the empty air. She was strong and vulnerable, fierce and gentle, and she had awakened something in him that he had thought was dead and buried. It terrified him. Jacob had lived alone for 5 years, and he had convinced himself that he preferred it that way. He had seen too much ugliness, done too many things he regretted, to believe he deserved the kind of happiness that came from connection and companionship. But Sarah McKenzie was making him question those beliefs, making him wonder if maybe, just maybe, he could have something more than solitude and survival. 3 weeks after he had paid her debt, Jacob made a decision. He could not keep watching her from a distance like some ghost or phantom. It was not fair to her, and it was driving him slowly mad. He needed to meet her properly, to let her see him and make her own choices about whether she wanted him in her life. The thought of actually talking to her made his stomach clench with anxiety, but he forced himself to act. He spent a morning making sure he was as presentable as a mountain man could be, trimming his beard and hair, washing thoroughly in the cold creek water, and putting on his cleanest shirt and pants. Then He loaded his saddlebags with fresh game and rode down to her property in the middle of the afternoon, when he knew she would be home. Sarah was working in her vegetable garden when she heard the horse approaching. She straightened up, shading her eyes against the sun, and felt her breath catch in her throat when she saw the rider. He was enormous, easily the largest man she had ever seen, with broad shoulders and a powerful build that spoke of hard physical labor and outdoor living. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, and his face was weathered and handsome in a rough, masculine way. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. They were a striking pale blue, intense and watchful, and they were fixed on her with an expression that made her heart skip. This was him. She knew it with absolute certainty. This was the man who had saved her land. Jacob dismounted slowly, his movements careful and deliberate, as if he was approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any moment. He pulled his hat from his head and held it in his hands, and when he spoke, his voice was deep and slightly rough. "Mrs. McKenzie, my name is Jacob Thorne. I live up in the mountains, and I came to see if you might need any help with your property." Sarah stared at him, her mind racing. He had not admitted to paying her debt, had not mentioned it at all. He was giving her the option to accept his presence without acknowledging what he had done, allowing them both a kind of dignified distance from the enormous gift he had given her. But Sarah had never been good at keeping her feelings hidden, and gratitude was burning in her chest like a fire. "You are him," she said softly. "You are the one who paid my debt." Jacob went very still, his blue eyes searching her face. "I do not know what you mean." "Please do not lie to me," Sarah said, taking a step closer. "Tom Henderson saw you go into the bank. Blackwell would not tell me who paid, but I know it was you. You are the one who has been helping me all these months, are you not? The deer, the firewood, all of it." Jacob stood silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Yes." "Why?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking slightly. "Why would you do that for me? You do not even know me." "I know enough," Jacob said. "I know you have been fighting to keep your land with everything you have. I know you work from dawn until dark every day. I know you have not given up even when most people would have. That is enough." "But the money," Sarah whispered, "that was your savings, was it not? You gave me everything you had." "I had no use for it," Jacob said simply. "You did. It was a simple choice." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes, and she did not try to stop them. "How can I ever repay you?" "You cannot, and I do not want you to try. The debt is paid, the land is yours. That is all there is to it." "That is not all," Sarah said fiercely. "You gave me back my life. You saved everything Daniel and I built together. That is not something I can just accept and move on from." At the mention of her husband, something flickered in Jacob's eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss. I heard in town that he died." 18 months ago, Sarah said, wiping at her eyes. "It has been hard, but I have been managing, or I thought I was, until Blackwell decided he wanted my land more than he wanted his money." "Blackwell is a vulture," Jacob said bluntly. "He preys on people when they are down. Well, thanks to you, he does not get to prey on me." Sarah took another step closer, looking up at Jacob with eyes that were bright with tears and determination. "Please, let me at least feed you. Let me cook you a proper meal as a small token of my gratitude." Jacob hesitated, clearly torn between his desire to accept and his habitual caution around people. Sarah saw the conflict in his face and pressed her advantage. "Please," she said softly, "you have done so much for me. Let me do this small thing for you." "All right," Jacob said finally. "Thank you." Sarah's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Come inside. I have a stew cooking, and there is fresh bread from this morning." Jacob followed her into the farmhouse, ducking slightly to clear the doorway. The interior was simple but clean, with handmade furniture and touches that spoke of a woman making the best of what she had. There were wildflowers in a jar on the table, curtains at the windows, and a quilt draped over the back of a rocking chair that looked like it had been stitched with love and patience. "Sit down," Sarah said, gesturing to the table. "It will only take a minute to dish up." Jacob sat carefully in one of the sturdy wooden chairs, feeling oversized and out of place in the cozy domestic space. He watched as Sarah moved around her small kitchen with practiced efficiency, ladling stew into bowls and slicing thick pieces of bread. She set the food in front of him with a smile, then sat down across from him with her own bowl. "I should warn you, I am not the best cook," she said. "Daniel used to say my stew could choke a goat, but he ate it anyway." Jacob took a bite and was surprised by how good it actually was. "This is excellent," he said honestly. "Much better than my own cooking." Sarah laughed, a sound that was rusty with disuse but genuine. "Well, the bar's probably pretty low if you have been living alone in the mountains." "You would be right about that," Jacob admitted, and he found himself smiling slightly. "Most of my meals involve meat and not much else." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, both of them adjusting to the strange intimacy of sharing a meal. Sarah found herself sneaking glances at Jacob, taking in the details of his appearance. He was even more imposing up close, with hands that looked like they could break stone and arms that strained against the fabric of his shirt. But there was also a gentleness in the way he moved, a careful control that suggested he was very aware of his own strength. "How long have you been living in the mountains?" Sarah asked finally. "About 5 years," Jacob said. "I came here after the war ended, and I finished my time as an Army scout." "That must have been hard work." "It had its moments." Jacob's expression darkened slightly. "I saw a lot of things I would rather forget. The mountains help with that." Sarah nodded, understanding implicit in her eyes. "Daniel fought in the war too. He did not talk about it much, but I know it haunted him sometimes." "It haunts most of us who were there," Jacob said quietly. They fell silent again, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that comes when two people recognize shared pain and do not feel the need to fill every moment with words. Sarah finished her stew and sat back, studying Jacob with open curiosity. "What made you decide to help me?" she asked. "Of all the people in this valley who might need help, why me?" Jacob considered the question carefully. "I saw you working your land one day about 6 months ago. You were trying to plow a field by yourself, and the horse kept giving you trouble. You should have given up, should have quit and found an easier task, but you did not. You kept at it until the job was done. I respected that. I started paying more attention after that, and the more I saw, the more I admired your determination." Sarah felt her cheeks flush with a mixture of pleasure and embarrassment. "I did not know anyone was watching. I'm sorry if that bothers you. I was not trying to intrude. I just wanted to make sure you were safe." "It does not bother me," Sarah said softly. "Knowing that someone cared enough to watch over me, it means more than I can say. I've felt very alone since Daniel died." Jacob met her eyes, and something passed between them, a spark of recognition and possibility. "You are not alone," he said. "Not anymore if you do not want to be." Sarah's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I would like to keep helping you, if you will let me. Not from a distance, but as a friend. You need help with this property, and I have time and skills to offer. It seems like a fair arrangement." "Jacob, you have already given me so much. I cannot ask you to give more of your time." "You are not asking. I am offering. There is a difference." Jacob leaned forward slightly, his intensity palpable. "I have been alone for 5 years because I thought that was what I wanted. But watching you these past months, I have realized that maybe what I really wanted was a reason to stop being alone. If you will have me, I would like to be that friend who helps. No obligations, no expectations, just someone you can count on." Sarah felt tears threatening again, but she blinked them back. "I would like that very much, but I insist on one condition." "What is that?" "You let me feed you regularly. If you are going to be working here, the least I can do is make sure you do not starve on your own cooking." Jacob's smile was slow but genuine, transforming his serious face into something warmer and more approachable. "That seems like a fair trade." From that day forward, Jacob became a regular presence at Sarah's farm. He came down from the mountains several times a week, always bringing fresh game or useful supplies, and spent his days helping with the endless work that a property demanded. He repaired fences that had been falling apart for months. He fixed the roof of the barn where it had started to leak. He helped Sarah harvest her struggling crops and plan for better ones next season. In return, Sarah fed him meals that were infinitely better than his own solitary cooking, and more importantly, gave him companionship that he had not realized he was starving for. They talked while they worked, sharing stories and observations, learning about each other in the gradual way of people who have all the time in the world. Sarah learned that Jacob had grown up in Missouri, the son of a farmer who had died when Jacob was 16. He had joined the army at 17, seeking adventure and escape from a stepmother who resented his presence. He had fought through some of the worst battles of the war and then served as a scout in the Western Territories, tracking hostile tribes and guiding wagon trains through dangerous country. He was educated beyond what his rough appearance suggested, having learned to read from his mother and developed a love of books that he indulged whenever he could find them. Jacob learned that Sarah had met Daniel when she was 19, during a barn dance in her hometown of Independence, Missouri. Daniel had been 22, full of dreams about starting fresh in the Western Territories where land was plentiful and opportunities were abundant. They had married after a brief courtship and made the journey west with a wagon train, staking their claim in this valley and building everything from scratch. Sarah had loved Daniel deeply, but she spoke of him with the acceptance of someone who had moved through grief to the other side, able to remember the good without being destroyed by the loss. The weeks turned into months, and the comfortable friendship between Sarah and Jacob deepened into something neither of them had quite anticipated. There were moments when their hands would brush while working, when their eyes would meet and hold for just a beat too long, when the air between them would seem to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Sarah found herself thinking about Jacob constantly, looking forward to his visits with an eagerness that had nothing to do with the help he provided and everything to do with his presence. She noticed the way his muscles flexed when he lifted heavy objects, the way his hair fell across his face when he concentrated on a task, the rare smile that transformed his expression from serious to almost boyish. She caught herself watching him when he did not know she was looking, her heart beating faster just from being near him. Jacob was fighting his own battle with feelings that had grown far beyond friendly concern. Every time he heard Sarah laugh, every time she smiled at him with those green eyes full of warmth, every time she touched his arm in passing, he felt something inside him crack open a little more. He wanted to pull her into his arms, to tell her that he had been half in love with her since the first time he saw her, to promise her that he would spend the rest of his life making sure she never had to struggle alone again. But he held back, terrified of ruining what they had, afraid that she might not want him in that way, that she might still be too attached to her husband's memory to consider a new love. So he channeled his feelings into action, working himself to exhaustion on her property, finding endless tasks that needed doing, anything to be near her and useful to her. It was Sarah who finally broke the careful distance they had been maintaining. It happened on a cool October evening, after Jacob had spent the day helping her prepare the farm for winter. They were sitting on her porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold, both of them tired and content from a day of good work. "Jacob," Sarah said quietly, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Why did you never marry? A man like you must have had opportunities." Jacob was silent for a long moment, staring at the darkening mountains. "I never found anyone I wanted to build a life with. I was always moving, always fighting or scouting or running from something. That is no kind of life to offer someone. And after I came to the mountains, I convinced myself I was better off alone." "And now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob turned to look at her, and the intensity in his blue eyes made her breath catch. "Now I think I might have been wrong about a lot of things." Sarah felt her heart hammering in her chest. "What kind of things?" "Things like whether I deserve happiness, whether I am capable of being what someone needs, whether I am too damaged by my past to build a future with anyone." Jacob paused, then continued with careful deliberation. "Things like whether the woman I have fallen in love with could ever feel the same way about me." The world seemed to stop. Sarah stared at Jacob, her mind struggling to process what she had just heard. "You love me?" "Yes," Jacob said simply. "I have loved you for months, maybe from the first moment I saw you. I know it is too soon after your husband's death. I know you might not be ready. I know I am not the kind of man most women dream about, but I cannot keep pretending that my feelings are just friendly concern. You deserve the truth." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling. "Jacob Thorne, you are exactly the kind of man I dream about. You are strong and kind and generous. You saved my life and my land without asking for anything in return. You have been my rock and my friend when I needed both desperately. How could I not love you?" Jacob went very still. "You love me?" "Yes, you impossible man. I love you. I have loved you for weeks now, maybe longer. I have been terrified to say anything because I thought you just saw me as some charity case, some widow you pitied." "I have never pitied you," Jacob said fiercely. "Admired you, worried about you, loved you, yes, but never pitied you. You are the strongest person I know." They stared at each other for a long moment, both of them struggling to believe that this was real, that the feelings they had been carrying alone were actually shared. Then Jacob stood up slowly and held out his hand. Sarah took it without hesitation, letting him pull her to her feet. They stood close together, Jacob's large hand still wrapped around hers, their faces only inches apart. "May I kiss you?" Jacob asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Please," Sarah whispered. Jacob kissed her with a gentleness that belied his size and strength, his lips soft against hers, his free hand coming up to cup her face with infinite care. Sarah melted into the kiss, her arms sliding around his waist, feeling the solid warmth of him against her, the steady beat of his heart under her palm. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard, and Sarah was crying and laughing at the same time. "I never thought I would feel this way again," she said. "After Daniel died, I thought that part of my life was over." "It does not dishonor his memory to find happiness again," Jacob said, stroking her hair back from her face. "He would want you to live, not just survive." "I know," Sarah said, "and I think he would have liked you. You are the kind of man he aspired to be, strong and honorable." They stood together on the porch as the stars came out overhead, holding each other and talking in low voices about their hopes and fears, making plans and promises for a future they would build together. It was not a wild, passionate declaration, but something deeper and more enduring, the kind of love that was built on respect and shared values and genuine understanding. Over the following weeks, their relationship deepened and solidified. Jacob still returned to his cabin in the mountains at night, maintaining propriety and giving them both time to adjust to the shift in their relationship. But he spent his days at Sarah's farm, and they worked side by side as a team, their partnership natural and effortless. The town noticed, of course. Sweetwater Creek was too small for anything to remain private for long. There was some gossip, some raised eyebrows at the widow McKenzie taking up with the mysterious mountain man. But most people were happy for Sarah. She had earned her happiness through hard work and perseverance, and if she found love with an unconventional man, well, that was her business. Blackwell was less pleased. He watched the development of Sarah and Jacob's relationship with barely concealed hostility, furious that his plans had been thwarted and that the mountain man had made a fool of him. He muttered darkly about impropriety and rushed courtships, but there was nothing he could do. Sarah's land was paid for free and clear, and she was perfectly within her rights to associate with whoever she chose. In December, as the first snows began to fall in the mountains, Jacob asked Sarah to marry him. He did it simply, without flowers or fancy speeches, kneeling in the mud of her farmyard after they had finished the evening chores. "Sarah McKenzie, I love you with everything I am. I know I am rough around the edges, and I know my life has not been conventional, but I promise you I will spend every day trying to be worthy of you. Will you marry me?" Sarah pulled him to his feet and kissed him thoroughly before answering. "Yes, Jacob Thorne, yes, I will marry you, and you are already worthy. You have always been worthy." They were married on a cold January day in 1877 in the small church at the center of Sweetwater Creek. Sarah wore a simple dress of dark green that brought out her eyes, and Jacob wore a new suit that he had bought specially for the occasion, though he looked slightly uncomfortable in the formal clothing. The ceremony was attended by most of the town, people who had come to wish Sarah well and to satisfy their curiosity about the mountain man who had captured her heart. Tom Henderson served as Jacob's best man, and Sarah's closest neighbor, a widow named Martha Thompson, stood up with her. The preacher, a kind man named Reverend Williams, kept the ceremony short and sweet, understanding that Jacob was not comfortable being the center of attention for long. When Jacob kissed his bride, there was a collective sigh from the assembled women, and more than one handkerchief was brought out to dab at tears. It was clear to everyone watching that these two people had found something rare and precious, a love that was real and deep and completely genuine. After the ceremony, there was a modest reception at the town hall, with food contributed by various townspeople and music provided by a fiddle player and a man with a guitar. Jacob endured the socializing with good grace, though Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders and knew he would be relieved when they could leave. They finally escaped in the early evening, riding together back to Sarah's farm, which was now their farm, their home. Jacob had moved his belongings down from the mountain cabin over the past few weeks, though he kept the cabin maintained as a retreat for when they needed to get away or when hunting required an extended stay in the high country. Inside the farmhouse, with the door closed against the cold winter night, they finally had privacy. Sarah turned to Jacob with a shy smile, suddenly nervous in a way she had not been when marrying Daniel all those years ago. "I'm glad we are finally alone," she said. Jacob pulled her close, his big hands gentle on her waist. "So am I. I have been wanting to have you all to myself for hours." "Then what are you waiting for?" Sarah asked, rising on her toes to kiss him. Jacob responded with a hunger that had been building for months, lifting her easily in his arms and carrying her to the bedroom. They came together with a passion tempered by tenderness, learning each other's bodies with care and attention, finding joy in the simple miracle of being together without reservation or holding back. Later, lying in the darkness with Sarah curled against his side, Jacob felt a peace he had never known before. This was what he had been missing during all those years of solitude, this sense of belonging and being needed, this warmth of connection that went beyond physical pleasure to something deeper and more sustaining. "I love you," he murmured into her hair. "I love you too," Sarah whispered back. "Thank you for saving me, Jacob, for giving me a future I thought I had lost." "You saved me too," Jacob said. "I just did not know I needed saving until I found you." The first year of their marriage was one of hard work and deepening love. They worked the farm together, making improvements and investments that would pay off in future years. Jacob's hunting skills kept them supplied with meat through the winter, and his knowledge of the land helped Sarah improve her crop yields come spring. They faced challenges, of course. There was a harsh blizzard in February that killed several head of livestock and required days of exhausting work to repair the damage. There was a conflict with a neighboring rancher over water rights that Jacob had to negotiate with careful diplomacy to avoid violence. There was the constant grinding work of a farm that demanded attention every single day regardless of weather or personal inclination. But through it all, they had each other. When Sarah was exhausted, Jacob was there to share the burden. When Jacob struggled with dark memories from his past, Sarah was there to remind him that he was good and worthy and loved. They built a partnership that was more than just romance, though the physical passion between them remained strong and vital. They built a life. In October of 1877, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. She told Jacob one evening after dinner, watching his face carefully to gauge his reaction. She need not have worried. Jacob's expression went through shock, wonder, and fierce joy in the space of a heartbeat, and then he was pulling her into his arms and spinning her around the kitchen with a whoop of happiness that was completely unlike his usually reserved nature. "A baby," he kept saying. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Sarah asked, laughing at his reaction. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Jacob said, setting her down carefully as if she had suddenly become made of glass. "Are you happy?" "Incredibly happy," Sarah said. "I had hoped, but I was not sure it would happen for us." Jacob knelt down and pressed his face against her still flat stomach, his arms wrapped around her waist. "Hello in there," he said softly. "This is your father. I cannot wait to meet you." Sarah ran her fingers through his long hair, her heart so full she thought it might burst. This was everything she had dreamed of when she and Daniel first came west, the family and the life they had planned to build. That it was happening with a different man did not make it less precious. If anything, it made it more so, because she knew how close she had come to losing everything, how lucky she was to have been given a second chance. The pregnancy was relatively easy, and Sarah continued working on the farm as long as she was able, though Jacob fussed over her like a mother hen and tried to make her rest more than she thought necessary. As her belly grew, Jacob would talk to their unborn child every night, telling stories about the mountains and the animals and the adventures he had had, promising that he would teach them everything he knew. Their son was born on a warm June evening in 1878, after a labor that lasted most of the day. Jacob stayed with Sarah throughout, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement, his face pale with worry, but his presence steady and strong. When the baby finally arrived, red-faced and screaming with healthy lungs, Jacob cried for the first time since he was a child. They named him Daniel Jacob, honoring both Sarah's first husband and their child's father. Sarah had worried that Jacob might object to giving their son Daniel's name, but he had insisted on it. "Daniel was your husband, and he deserves to be remembered," Jacob said. "Our son can carry his name with pride. It does not diminish what we have. It honors where you came from." Little Daniel was a healthy baby, with his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair. He was also loud and demanding, keeping them both up at all hours with his needs. But neither Sarah nor Jacob minded the exhaustion. They took turns walking the floor with him at night, sitting together in the rocking chair, and marveling at the tiny, perfect human they had created. Jacob proved to be a devoted father, carrying Daniel in a sling against his chest while he worked, talking to him constantly, handling him with a gentleness that seemed impossible given the size of his hands. Sarah would often find them together, Jacob murmuring to the baby about the farm or the weather or whatever else came to mind, Daniel staring up at his father with wide eyes as if drinking in every word. The farm prospered under their combined efforts. Jacob's skills as a hunter and his knowledge of the land complemented Sarah's farming expertise and business sense. They expanded their herd of cattle, planted additional crops, and built a new barn to replace the old one that had been barely standing when Jacob first arrived. Word got around that the mountain man and his wife ran an honest, hard-working operation, and people began seeking them out for trade and advice. When Daniel was 2 years old, Sarah found herself pregnant again. This time, the news was met with calm happiness rather than wild joy, the pleased satisfaction of a plan unfolding as hoped. Their daughter was born in March of 1881, a tiny thing with Jacob's blue eyes and Sarah's delicate features. They named her Emma Rose, and she proved to be as different from her brother as night from day. Where Daniel was loud and demanding, Emma was quiet and content, happy to lie in her cradle and observe the world with those striking blue eyes. Daniel, now 3 years old and full of energy, was fascinated by his baby sister. He would sit beside her cradle for hours, chattering at her and bringing her his favorite toys, appointed himself her protector, even though she was far too young to need protecting from anything. Jacob watched his growing family with a sense of profound gratitude that never quite faded. There were moments when he had to stop and simply take in the scene before him. Sarah nursing Emma in the rocking chair while Daniel played at her feet, the evening light streaming through the windows, the sounds of home and life and love filling the small farmhouse. These were the moments that made everything he had been through worthwhile, that justified every hardship and validated every choice. The years passed in the way they do for happy families, marked by small milestones and seasonal rhythms rather than dramatic events. Daniel grew into a sturdy boy who loved the outdoors and followed his father everywhere, learning to track and hunt and survive in the wilderness. Emma became a bright, curious child who loved books and learning, often found reading or asking endless questions about everything she encountered. In 1884, when Daniel was 6 and Emma 3, Sarah gave birth to twins, 2 boys they named Thomas and James. The farmhouse suddenly felt much smaller and infinitely louder, but they managed. Jacob built an addition onto the house, creating more bedrooms and a larger kitchen, while Sarah organized their expanded family with the efficiency of a general commanding an army. Jacob was 40 years old now, his hair showing streaks of gray and his body bearing the accumulated aches of a life of hard physical labor. But he was happy in a way he had never imagined possible during his years of solitude. He would sometimes catch himself smiling for no particular reason, just from the simple joy of being surrounded by the family he had never expected to have. Sarah, at 32, had grown from the desperate young widow Jacob had first watched from the mountains into a confident, capable woman who managed a thriving farm and raised 4 children with grace and determination. She still had moments when she thought about Daniel, her first husband, but they were gentle memories now, tinged with fondness rather than grief. She knew he would have approved of the life she had built, of the man she had married, of the family they had created. The town of Sweetwater Creek had grown along with their family. More settlers had arrived, drawn by the promise of good land and opportunity. The town now boasted a proper school, which Daniel attended and Emma would soon join. There was talk of bringing in a railroad spur, which would make shipping cattle and crops much easier. Blackwell was still around, still running his bank, but he had learned to leave the thorns alone. Jacob's reputation as a man who did not tolerate being crossed had spread, and even the greedy banker was not foolish enough to test those limits a second time. He contented himself with preying on easier targets, though even that was becoming more difficult as people learned to be wary of his tricks. On a warm summer evening in 1886, Sarah and Jacob sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard. Daniel, now 8, was teaching his younger siblings how to skip stones in the creek that ran past their property. Emma, 5 years old and serious beyond her years, was carefully explaining the proper technique to the twins, who were 2 and more interested in splashing in the water than in skipping stones. "Can you believe this is our life?" Sarah asked, leaning against Jacob's shoulder. "Sometimes I have to pinch myself," Jacob admitted. 10 years ago I was alone in the mountains, convinced I would live and die that way. Now, look at us." 10 years ago I was about to lose everything, Sarah said. "And then a mysterious mountain man paid off my debt without even telling me his name." Jacob smiled. "I was not very good at the mysterious part. You figured me out pretty quickly." "I did. And then I fell in love with you. Best thing that ever happened to me, you falling in love with me." Sarah turned to kiss him, a soft press of lips that still held the spark that had first ignited between them all those years ago. "Best thing that ever happened to me was you watching over me and deciding I was worth saving." "You were always worth saving, Sarah. You just needed someone to see it." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sunset over the mountains that had brought them together. Their children's laughter drifted across the yard, and somewhere in the barn one of their horses whinnied. Smoke rose from the chimney of their expanded farmhouse, and the fields beyond were green with growing crops. This was the life they had built together, from desperation and loneliness in one man's quiet act of extraordinary generosity. It was not perfect. There were still hard days and difficult challenges, money worries and sick children and weather that refused to cooperate. But underneath all of that was a foundation of love and commitment that had been tested and proven strong. Jacob had saved Sarah's land, but in doing so, he had saved himself. He had found a reason to rejoin the world, to believe that he was capable of being more than just a survivor. He had found a home, not just in the physical sense of a house and property, but in the deeper sense of belonging and being needed, and having people who loved him unconditionally. Sarah had been given a second chance at the life she thought she had lost. She had found a partner who was strong enough to support her, but wise enough to respect her independence, who could be both gentle and fierce, depending on what the situation required. She had built a family and a future that honored her past without being trapped by it. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Daniel called out that he was hungry, and Emma helpfully informed him that dinner would not be ready for another hour because Mother had said so. The twins, tired from their play, came running up to the porch to be cuddled by their parents. Jacob scooped them both up, one in each arm, and carried them into the house while Sarah followed with a smile. There was dinner to prepare, and children to feed, and 1,000 small tasks that made up the fabric of family life. But as Sarah lit the lamps and Jacob settled the twins at the table and Emma helped set out plates, they moved together with the practiced ease of partners who knew each other inside and out. Later that night, after the children were all asleep and the house was finally quiet, Sarah and Jacob lay in bed talking in low voices about their plans for the future. They wanted to expand their cattle herd next year. They needed to think about building a separate cabin for Daniel eventually, since he would be grown before they knew it. Emma would need books as she got older, her hunger for knowledge already outpacing what the small schoolhouse could provide. "We have done well," Jacob said, pulling Sarah close against his chest. "Better than I ever dreamed." "We have," Sarah agreed. "And it all started because you saw a stubborn widow refusing to give up her land and decided she needed help." "Best decision I ever made," Jacob murmured, kissing the top of her head. "Second best," Sarah corrected. "The The best was deciding to stop hiding in the mountains and come down to meet me properly. Jacob chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. You are right. That was the best decision. Everything else just followed from that. They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together. The farm that Sarah had nearly lost was now a thriving homestead, a legacy they would pass on to their children and grandchildren. The love that had grown from desperate need and quiet kindness had blossomed into something enduring and beautiful, a partnership that would last the rest of their lives. Years continued to pass in that way, each one adding new layers to the life they had built. The children grew and thrived. Daniel proved to be as skilled in the wilderness as his father, though he also had a head for business that Sarah encouraged him to develop. Emma's love of learning led her to become a teacher herself when she was old enough, educating the children of Sweetwater Creek in the growing schoolhouse. The twins, Thomas and James, were inseparable and eventually took over much of the farm work as Jacob grew older. In 1895, when Daniel was 17, he brought home a young woman named Catherine whom he wanted to marry. Jacob and Sarah liked her immediately, seeing in her the same determination and strength that had characterized their own relationship. The wedding was held on the farm, with half the county attending, and Jacob walked his eldest son to stand with his bride, with tears of pride streaming down his weathered face. Emma married at 19 to a young lawyer from Denver who had come to Sweetwater Creek to open a practice. He was intelligent and kind, and more importantly, he supported Emma's desire to continue teaching after their marriage. They settled in town, close enough to visit regularly, but far enough to establish their own life. The twins showed no signs of marrying anytime soon, perfectly content to run the farm and live the bachelor life, much to Sarah's amused exasperation. Sarah and Jacob grew old together, their hair turning gray and then white, their faces lined with the marks of years spent outdoors and a life well lived. Jacob's hands, once so strong they could break wood with bare force, became gnarled with arthritis, but they could still hold Sarah's with perfect gentleness. Sarah's eyes, which had once been so sharp she could spot a hawk at a mile, needed spectacles for reading, but they still sparkled when she looked at her husband. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1902, their children and grandchildren gathered at the farm for a celebration. The house that Jacob had expanded multiple times over the years was filled to bursting with family, 3 generations of Thorns and the spouses and children they had acquired along the way. Daniel stood up during dinner and raised his glass. I want to propose a toast to my parents. They built this family from nothing, from a moment of kindness that changed both their lives. They taught us what love looks like, what commitment means, and how to face hardship with courage and grace. Everything we are, we owe to them. Everyone drank and cheered, and Sarah found herself crying happy tears while Jacob squeezed her hand under the table. Later, when the party had wound down and most of the family had left, Sarah and Jacob walked out to the porch where they had first confessed their love to each other all those years ago. 25 years, Sarah said wonderingly. Has it really been that long? Feels like both forever and no time at all, Jacob said, settling into his rocking chair with a small grunt. His back was not what it used to be, but he refused to complain about the aches and pains of age. Do you ever regret it? Sarah asked. Giving up your solitude for this chaotic family life? Jacob looked at her as if she had lost her mind. Regret it? Sarah, marrying you and building this life with you is the only thing I've ever done that I do not regret even a little bit. You gave me everything I did not know I needed. Purpose, love, family, a reason to get up every morning beyond just survival. How could I possibly regret that? Sarah smiled, settling into her own rocking chair beside him. I just wanted to make sure. You were so content alone in those mountains. I sometimes worry that we overwhelmed you. You did overwhelm me, Jacob admitted with a smile. But in the best possible way. I needed to be overwhelmed. I needed to be pulled out of my solitude and reminded that life is meant to be lived, not just endured. They sat together as the sun set, holding hands across the small distance between their rocking chairs, watching the last of their grandchildren play in the yard. The farm spread out before them, the land that Sarah had nearly lost and that Jacob had saved, with a single act of generosity that had changed both their lives forever. I love you, Sarah said softly. I have loved you from the moment you walked into my yard and offered to help without expecting anything in return. I love you too, Jacob replied. I loved you before I ever met you, from the first moment I saw you fighting for your land. You were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and you still are. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah leaned her head on Jacob's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. They had lived a full life together, had weathered storms both literal and figurative, had built something lasting and true. And as they sat there in the peaceful evening, surrounded by the fruits of their labor and love, they both knew that they had been blessed beyond measure. The mountain man had saved the widow's land with his quiet generosity, but in the end, they had saved each other, finding in their unexpected love a redemption and happiness that neither had dared to hope for. And that, more than any amount of money or land, was the true treasure they had discovered together,